time is such an interesting thing to me. This week something happened. I have a little clock that I usually have parked on the organ there, and that helps me sort of stay tuned so that we can get out of here by 10:30. Well, that little clock disappeared. So I suspect we might be here for a while because I'm not really sure what the limit is. But if you get your limit, just put your hand up and I will start slowing it down a little bit. I've also learned from my experience that sometimes the service will go 10 minutes over time, and other times it will go 10 minutes under time. But generally, we manage to strike a balance, so that if by some chance today we end up being done here in, say, about another 15 minutes, I hope you won't complain. You'll just have some extra time for visiting and coffee. But let's put time in God's hands this morning. Let's forget about it. In the ancient world, there were two gods. One, his name was Kronos, and one was named Kairos. And Kronos was the god of the clock, and Kairos was the god of eternity. This is from the Greek mythology. And we tend sometimes to get stuck in the world of time. Today, I'd like you just to breathe easy and pretend we live in a timeless place. And who knows, we may come out just right. I called my talk this morning, "Who is my neighbor?" And I called it that just on the basis of my reflections while I was walking through the streets of Steinbach. One of the things that I like to do when I have some alone time is go for a long walk, just on the chance that I might meet someone and have an interesting encounter. And I'd like you to know that in my life, I've had thousands of interesting encounters. And in each of those encounters, I've had a chance to share something about me, but more importantly, I've had a chance to learn something about other people, how they see the world. Now, I'd like to trace this interest of mine back to before I was even born. You see, my mom lived in a small Frisian village. Friesland is just north of Holland. And in that village, my mom liked to ride her bike, a fiets it was called. She liked to ride her bike from village to village, doing the kinds of things that moms do. And this carried on even after she conceived a child, and that child was me. So in the womb, I was already going about in the streets of the city, participating with my mom as she encountered persons that she met along her way. My mom had a reputation of always taking time to share with persons whom she met. And in that, I began to learn, not all of it while I was in the womb. This carried on. When I was first born, she had me in a carriage and she'd walk the streets of the town, and between villages even. You can do that in Holland because the villages are closer together than they might be in Canada. But always Mom stopping to chat. And I think as a little boy, I simply absorbed that. And it wasn't just my mom. It seemed to be part of my culture. I had an uncle, Omatis, we called him, and Omatis was often on the receiving end of my auntie's crankiness, especially after church. After church, she would be done, and she'd go sit in the car and wait to go home. And she would sit, and she would wait, and she would sit, and she would wait. And then when Omatis finally came into the car to take them home, she said, "Do you have to talk to everybody?" And it was true. Omatis just loved to share time with people. And the same was true of my grandpa, Paka, his name, we called him. Paka loved to walk down the streets, and if there was a construction site, he loved to watch the men work. And then if he had a chance, he loved to talk with them about their work. So I'd like to, and Beppa, that's Grandma, Beppa was just as perturbed as Tante Hinka. She too was more of a quiet, private person, and she preferred not to spend so much time waiting for Papa while he talked to strangers. So I absorbed this love of meeting strangers. And that has been a pattern in all of my life. And I thought this morning I might share with you a couple of stories about persons whom I have met, who have affected me, and whom I have affected. And one of the ones I really like is happened right here in Steinbach. At the time, Barbara was traveling for her work, and so I would often have weekends or evenings alone, and again, I would go for a walk. And often I would go to, I think it was called Robbins at the time, a little coffee shop at the intersection of 12 and Main. And there was a member of our congregation, Cindy, yes, thank you. Many minds are better than one mind. Cindy Sobering, and she was always gracious to me. And one evening I was in the coffee shop, and Cindy and I had passed the time of day, and I sat down to have my coffee and look through my book, but really I wasn't reading. My ears were listening. What were the other people at the other tables talking about? And was it possible that I could get in on one of those conversations? Well, one night it was particularly interesting. There was 3 young men from the Providence Bible College, and they were talking about their studies in the Greek language. And I could not resist. Oh, are you Bible students? And didn't we get into a conversation? And we sat there for about 90 minutes, maybe even 2 hours. We really didn't know because time didn't seem to be the issue. And we talked about just about everything that was of interest to us. And that was delightful for me. Some folks love to go to places like Disneyland. I love to meet strangers in coffee shops. Well, the next day I was at home on Wilson where we lived, and wasn't there a knock on the door. I went to the door, I opened it, and there was a young man. He said, "Hi, my name is Jason." He said, "I go to Providence Bible College, and last night some of my friends told me that they met you, and they had a really good conversation. Could I have a conversation with you too?" And we did. And not only that, but Jason and I continued to be in conversation through all the years. And that's rather remarkable because I'm a United Church clergy, and we have a reputation in places like Providence and other Bible colleges of being a bit too liberal. Nevertheless, Jason and I shared many things in common. And I'd like to encourage you that even though there are differences in the way we understand the Bible and the world, we do better when we focus on the common ground that we share, our respect for one another, our tolerance of one another, our readiness to learn from one another. I had the great honor of presiding at Jason's wedding in Vancouver, where he was a student now at Regent's Bible College. And Regent is a pretty conservative theological institution. And it was a delight for me as a United Church minister to be able to address that company and to speak about the friendship that Jason and I had acquired. A chance meeting which produced a lasting friendship. And to this day, Jason continues to suggest that I was part of who he is becoming. He has since earned his doctorate in philosophy. He is now working to become a priest in the Anglican Church. And I delight in remaining in contact with this stranger met along the way. Now this next memory is a little bit different. It goes a little bit back before when I was a single man in Winnipeg, and I used to every evening after supper go for a long walk around the city, and at the middle of the walk was a coffee shop. But during the walk, I would meet people. And over a space of about 4 or 5 years, I cannot count how many drunks I walked home. I would meet them in the street, we would talk, I would get to know a little bit about their life story, and then I would say, "Why don't we get you home and get you into bed?" And I would walk them home and get them into their beds. No, I'm not a gay man. I just want you to know that I wasn't taking advantage of anybody. I would get them into the beds, and as they were laying there getting ready to pass out, I would suggest, "Why don't you give me your bottle and I'll take it away with me?" Well, again and again, "Oh, well, no, maybe tomorrow." And generally, I did not save any drunks from their habit with alcohol. But I learned so much about what it is that leads men to be out in the streets alone, addicted to one substance or another. Every time there was a story in the background, a failed business, a lost love, a disappointment in one circumstance or another. And I like to feel that in a wonderfully surprising way, I was a means of God's grace to touch these people. And I'm not suggesting that they would have miraculous conversion experiences, but I do know that when a person who feels lost and alone is welcomed, respected, and affirmed, they may have opportunity to rethink and reconsider their priorities in life. I have other kinds of stories about walking down the street and seeing a restaurant, and it seems to be maybe Halloween or Valentine's Day, and the people are celebrating. And I used to love to just quickly slip my clown nose out of my pocket, walk into the restaurant, and do kind of a Charlie Chaplin imitation, and just walk around as if I was a broken-hearted lover. And people would look and they would smile and they would think, who is that man? And then I would walk out again. And I had many of such encounters. One time I was walking down the street and there was two buskers in front of a liquor commission, which, if you know buskers at all, it's a prime location for generating some income. These two buskers, a guitar player and a saxophone player, were fighting. Each one thought that they had been there first, and they thought it was their right to be at that preferred spot to earn some money. What do? Take out the clown nose, and in this case I reached in my wallet and I also took out a $50 bill. And then I began to do a pantomime with the $50 bill, and it attracted some attention. They stopped quarreling. People started watching, and I symbolically lifted the $50 and I tore it in half, and I said, "Figure it out, boys." So they had to cooperate if they were going to make use of that money. And what I like to think is that all those people who witnessed these kinds of exchanges would go home to their supper tables and say, "Guess what I saw today in the street? A silly fellow doing silly things." But also some of them may be thinking, "It's true. Why do we fight when we could cooperate?" Lots of stories. What I would like to speak about a little bit to you is the text about loving God and loving neighbor. It's exactly the same as learning how to be a basketball player. It's exactly the same as learning how to be a piano player. It's exactly the same as learning any skill, any talent that you want to develop. Being a good neighbor is something that you can practice. And I know from my association with all of you that most of you are exceptionally good neighbors. I've heard your stories, and it pleases me immensely to think of you out there in the world making the difference that you can make. Now, I don't want to suggest that the only thing we are called to do on the basis of the text is to be kind to strangers, to be respectful of them, to learn from them, to walk with them. I want to suggest that those encounters become precious when your primary relationship is with God. And I am not speaking here of some graven image God, some God whose identity is carved in doctrinal statements which are immutable and can't be touched. I'm talking about the God who is as free as the wind, who chooses to appear in any place, any time, to accomplish surprising good. As you get to know the God who has claimed you, the God who you know loves you, as you get to know that God, And one of the ways to pursue that relationship, of course, is to study about God by opening the Scriptures and other books which speak about the Scriptures, and also being in association with persons who share your interest in God, so that you can encourage one another in the relationship with God. And I am not connecting love of God with love of the neighbor so that you can go out there and say to your neighbors, do you know that you're going to hell unless you get saved? That's not what I'm talking about. There are places where folks talk about that, and I think perhaps that's important for these folks. But for me, it's not. My thinking is that if you get to know God, God will eventually begin to fill your character so that the qualities that we see in God, love, generosity, kindness, encouragement, support, all these qualities which affirm the persons we are and the persons we meet. As you get to be known by this God, and as you get to be filled with the Spirit of this God, every one of your relationships will become a grace-filled relationship. You do not have to argue with people about religion. Sometimes it's better just to say, yes, I see what you're getting at. I see what you're trying to say. I don't agree, but I see it. And in this way, ministering to them the patience of God, the readiness of God to walk along not just with friends, but also with adversaries, people who are totally different. So when we come to church, we do not come here to in some way please God, although I assure you God is very pleased. But that's not our motive. Our motive is to get to know God, to walk with God, to talk with God, to be in the quiet alone with God, and then to go back out into the world knowing that God has, if I may use this word, infected you, and that you are now infectious, and that wherever you go, people are going to catch little bits and pieces of God's love. And you may not change anybody's experience in one episode, but over time you will have played a part in what we call the salvation. And when I say the word salvation, I like you to think of medicine. Remember we used to speak about salve, you rub it on a wound. Salvation is healing. Sometimes people feel lost and disconnected from God and from their neighbors. By your intercessions, they can get reconnected. And that calls to mind one more story which kind of makes my point. I spent many years hitchhiking around in Canada, and many times, especially in Saskatchewan it seems, I would get picked up by a couple. And it would be a couple like some of the couples in this place. And as they'd be driving me along the road, I would ask them, why did you stop to pick me up? And many times they would answer, because we have a son or a daughter who left home in anger or in disappointment. We don't know where they are, and we just keep hoping that if we be kind to strangers, maybe somebody will be kind to our sons and daughters as well. And I'd like you to know that over time, because I was a lost and seeking young man, over time, the acts of kindness of those persons who had no real reason to stop and help me, those acts of kindness came into me like drops of water, and drop by drop I began to be filled up, and I began to change my mind. Maybe the world was not hopeless. Maybe the world was not meaningless. Maybe there was something good in it. I think the love of those people changed my life, drop by drop. So I encourage you to get connected with God, however you imagine that. Get connected with the Holy Spirit, the truth that brings life. And trust that as you deepen your connection, you will become even better at being friends and neighbors to all of your relations. Now, contrary to my advice at the beginning, my brain, the left brain or the right brain, I'm not sure which one is saying, George, careful, you wanted to extend it, but you may be going on a bit too long. So I'm going to say the word that ministers say at this time. Amen.